now countries like South Korea are the beacons, and sort of to show how, undemocratically behaving leaders, this is how they get removed, and they don't become a menace to democracy anymore, and the lesson gets sent. My most recent book, which included South Korea as one of 12 cases it looks at, is called From Development to Democracy, The Transformations of Modern Asia. And I wrote that with Joseph Wong from the University of Toronto.
I thought it was very interesting how you mentioned about Korea's background, the fundamental of our democracy. Especially, I thought this chart was very interesting. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is?
Sure. So historically, South Korea, much like Taiwan and Japan, went through an experience of building up a strong developmental state, a bureaucratic apparatus with a strong commitment to economic development, which had a lot of support from ruling political elites. So even though those elites were authoritarian in South Korea's case, they really did deliver pretty serious economic development. Of course, the Korean people did it themselves too. This wasn't something that was like a gift from the regime. But because of that long experience of economic development and relative economic equality compared to a lot of cases, what we argue is that in places like South Korea, that the ruling elite had what we call both victory confidence and stability confidence. So the idea is that they were confident that conservative parties would do relatively well in elections and wouldn't just be wiped away completely. And they were confident that elections wouldn't hand power to some kind of incredibly irresponsible leftist, socialist, pro-North Korea, anti-developmental sort of a ruling group. And so really the big argument in a way is that developmental states create developmental voters. And because South Korean voters became committed to economic development, they weren't going to vote for parties that opposed the sort of overall agenda and trajectory that South Korea had followed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
But if that's the case, does it mean we're more apt to go back to the authoritarian regime? Is it that more easier because our background?
There's sort of two ways that authoritarian regimes can end. They can end by collapsing completely, or they can end by conceding democratic reforms when they haven't collapsed completely. And South Korea is the second sort of case. So the ruling elite did not collapse. They weren't swept, out to history. The same people who were powerful in South Korea before the transition remained major players after the transition. So there's sort of a trade-off or a paradox, which is that in some ways, giving those people a stake in the system means they have less reason to overturn democracy. But putting them in powerful positions means they have more potential, more capacity to overturn democracy. So there's really no easy way out of that trade-off. And South Korea has also been unusual in the degree to which you have used, prosecution against old, former presidents and the like to sort of make sure that power is not abused. And South Korea also stands out in the way in which the military has really become subservient to civilian authorities in a way that is pretty rare in Asia and certainly in other young democracies around the world. In South Korea's case, I think the key is that that the people and your institutions sort of came together in this recent crisis and pushed back and just insisted that democracy was not going away. South Korea was not going back to the bad old days of martial law, and it was nipped in the bud. And so, although I'm sure in South Korea the last few weeks have been frightening and worrying and distressing, from the rest of the world's perspective, South Korea is probably the best example I've seen of passing the stress test and proving how democratic it is and proving the democratic strength that South Korea has, because it really, basically the whole system and society really rallied and said this is not going to pass. And really fought back and saved the democratic system in South Korea, which will still have challenges up ahead. But for the time being, it's a remarkable victory and quite an exciting one for those of us who are concerned about democratic rollback all around the world. And so I think the lesson that I sort of draw generally from these kinds of crises is that what's really important is that the individual leader who defies democratic values and who moves in an authoritarian direction, they need to be dealt with. They need to be excluded from politics. They need to be, punished. It doesn't necessarily have to be a harsh punishment, but certainly not be allowed to hold power again. And so I think that's proof of what South Korean democracy has accomplished, that again, the fact that South Korea's citizens came out the way they did and just simply would not accept this move. And even conservative parliamentarians voting in favor of impeachment, showing that they agree the system has worked. The system has worked incredibly well. South Korea has not stopped its economic development. It has not become weakened by democracy. Democracy has strengthened South Korea. And we saw South Korea's people and its leaders, for the most part, really rally behind that idea.
Recently, I came across a local news article mentioning that you had joined a statement supporting the call for President Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment. Besides you, there were 281 renowned political scientists from around the world who joined as well. After the statement was shared, many Koreans felt deeply grateful to you and the other political scientists who participated. Could you elaborate on what led you to participate in this statement and explain in more detail on the key points it emphasizes?
Sure. So I think that you say that South Koreans were grateful to political scientists for signing a petition. Well, I assure you that political scientists were grateful to South Koreans for fighting the way they did to protect democracy in the face of a martial law declaration and to show the world what it looks like to actually oppose an insurrection by an elected leader. Because the United States had an insurrection led by its elected leader on January 6th. And there were no consequences. There were for a few of the protesters, but not for the person who inspired the whole thing and who tried to undermine the entire democratic system. So for those of us around the world, we see examples of elected leaders attacking democracy in all kinds of ways, usually more subtle ways and more gradual ways than what President Yoon attempted. But we see these happening, and we're concerned because South Korea is a place where the people rose in the 1980s and insisted on their democratic rights, and that's a very hard-fought victory. And we don't want to see that victory be taken away from the South Korean people. South Korea is also a place that's been, I think, really a model of what it looks like to have a functioning democratic system, which continues to pursue economic development, which doesn't lead to too much radicalization, doesn't lead to instability, doesn't lead to civil war. So all the nightmare scenarios we hear around the world from dictators who say, well, if we have democracy, we'll turn into Syria, or we'll turn into Egypt, or we'll turn into the Soviet Union and collapse. These are cherry-picked examples. And what we need are examples of countries that have shown that democratization can make things more stable. They can make things more predictable. It can make sure that people all have a stake in the system, along with all the other benefits like getting rid of political prisoners and other, and censorship and things that dictatorships do. So I think we all have a stake anytime a democracy in the world is under attack. I think we all have a stake in defending it and siding with the people in the countries who are fighting for democracy to defend it. So this is the furthest thing from outsiders telling Korea what to do. This is a long way away from the world where people said, "Oh, America is the democratic beacon and has to spread democracy around the world." We're not in that world. I'm not sure we were ever in that world. We're definitely not in that world now. And now countries like South Korea are the beacons, and to show how undemocratically behaving leaders, this is how they get removed. And they don't become a menace to democracy anymore. And the lesson gets sent. And it becomes clear that anyone contemplating this kind of ridiculous maneuver, which it really was by Yoon, is going to pay a very, very steep price.